All right, it's 3:05, so let's go ahead and get started. I am alone in the classroom today, so I'm going to go ahead and remove my mask, and I'll put it back on if anyone happens to show up. So today our topic is Islamic art and architecture, and now that we've gone through a lot of different empires so far this semester, we've learned about, for example, the gunpowder empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. We can begin to contextualize some of these different works of art and some of these different architectural styles, right? We'll see distinctive differences between, Mughal architecture and Safavid architecture and Ottoman and so forth. And so I think having that historical context is important before we could dive into this subject. It's a fun subject. I studied art as an undergraduate, so I always enjoy the opportunity to discuss art, which I only get to do about once a semester, maybe. And as you know, we have our second exam of the semester on Thursday, and that exam will cover everything that we've studied since our first exam. So that begins with the lecture on the rise of the Arab Islamic Empire when we talked about the different caliphates. Then we went on and explored Sharia. We talked about women in Islam. We talked about Islamic theology, family and festivals, the gunpowder empires, and now today's lecture, Islamic art and architecture. So stuff from all those lectures is going to be on our exam on Thursday. It's 25 multiple choice questions, 3 short answer or short essay questions, and then a long form essay question. I think I have that information specified on the study guide. I posted the study guide, last Thursday for you. Always give you a week's notice before the exam. And if you know the material on the study guide, you should probably be fine, right? But keep in mind that, at this point in the semester, we've moved beyond real basic questions, the sort of stuff you would have seen on the first exam, like what is the Quran or what is a hadith and things like that. So now we're getting into some more complex topics with regard to the academic study of Islam. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into that lecture. And then once we return to class, I have us scheduled for no class next Tuesday because it's election day. And I think initially the intent was to have that as a holiday, but with the COVID changes in the schedule, they might have done away with that, but we're gonna keep that. So if you haven't already, go out and vote that day. It's your responsibility as an American citizen to do that. And then on Thursday, November 5th, we will commence the third section of the course on modern Islam, and I'm a specialist in modern Islam, so this is my primary area. And we'll begin by talking about the decline of the gunpowder empires and the rise of a new sect of Sunni Islam known to outsiders as Wahhabism. So for those of you who are intel and national security majors, make sure that you tune in for that lecture. I can see I've got 10 out of 27 students watching this lecture today. Tune into that lecture because Wahhabism is an important component when you talk about the rise of violent extremist movements in the Islamic world today. So that lecture will be on November 5th. And I was actually revising my slides. I'm freshening it up. Going to present the material in a slightly different way this semester. So I'm excited to do that. I think I've made some nice improvements to that presentation. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this topic. I want to begin by talking about this whole concept of Islamic art. So referring to the existence of Islamic art is kind of lazy. I'm going to use it, but I want to point out the problems with it. So the way that label is used in Western universities, Western discourse, it comes to refer to all the different types of arts that come out of parts of the world where the majority of the population is Muslim, or just from Muslims, even minority communities, but it just sort of gets thrown out there. And the problem with that, of course, is today, for example, there's 50 countries in the world that have Muslim majority populations. That's a lot of different ethnic groups. That's a lot of different cultures. And they each produce their own distinctive styles of art. When we talk about art that comes out of Europe, we don't label it all as Christian art. When we use that term, we tend to use that to refer specifically to like works of art that would be used in like a church setting, a very explicitly religious context. But the way Western scholars use the term Islamic art, it's this really wide-reaching umbrella label for any types of art that comes out of Muslim communities. And by referring to all these diverse cultures just as being Islamic art, you're obscuring the different cultures that are part of the Muslim majority world, right? So the art that comes out of a country like Indonesia is going to be noticeably different from the art that comes out of, let's say, a West African country like Senegal. But in Western academic discourse, it tends to all get grouped together as quote unquote Islamic art, which is to say that when people refer to Islamic art in Western academic discourse, they're not talking specifically about art that is used within a mosque, right, that's used in an explicitly religious setting. It gets used really widely to refer to like anything that is produced. And so it's a term that lacks nuance, that lacks refinement, and that should probably really be broken down and dismantled and deconstructed. But with that said, we're going to proceed with this flawed, but I think nevertheless important exploration of Islamic art among all these different peoples and cultures around the world, right? Noting, of course, that there's lots of different peoples who are Muslims living in different parts of the world, different countries. They have their own cultural traditions. They have their own traditional art forms. And so I don't mean to obscure those unique contributions and differences by just labeling it all Islamic art, okay? When we think of this category of Islamic art, for all its flaws, there are some reoccurring features that are noteworthy and that we do see pop up in specifically religious contexts, such as the decoration of a mosque or the decoration of a religious manuscript. But art is a tricky subject in Islamic thought. It can be quite controversial. We know that in Islamic theology, there's this real emphasis on tawheed, on monotheism, on the oneness of God, that Allah is transcendent, has never incarnated, is ultimately beyond human comprehension, right? This all-powerful being. And there's a real strong condemnation of idolatry. If we go back to the story of Muhammad, he's born into this polytheistic society in Mecca, where the different gods and goddesses are depicted with wood and stone, and they worship these idols. So Muhammad condemns the worship of those idols, those statues of wood and stone and other physical representations of the divine, and instead talks about the worship of the one God, this one God that is transcendent, that's beyond statues, images, and so forth. And when we look to the pages of the Quran, we can find these explicit condemnations of idolatry, condemnations of the worship of the old gods. And we know that those old gods were represented in physical forms, and that when Muhammad conquers Mecca in the year 630, he goes to the Kaaba and he destroys those different idols, right? He does away with those physical representations of the divine. But we won't find any explicit condemnations of the visual arts as a whole in the Quran. Right? The content that's relevant to the arts there is really about idolatry and the worship of these idols. Not so much just, making paintings of, let's say, great figures in a society's history or something like that. But when we turn to the hadith literature, right? So we've learned about the Quran and the hadith. Quran is number one, and that's the speech of Allah. And we learned how that is understood to be uncreated in my lecture on Islamic theology. We then have this other body of knowledge, the collections of hadith, these stories, these reports about things that Muhammad is said to have done or said, or also his earliest followers will find material about them in the hadith as well. And it's in the pages of the different collections of hadith that we will find explicit condemnations of the visual arts. And so when we talk about navigating Islamic art, the material in the hadith really has a significant impact on the products that we see, the way artists create and express their ideas. So when we look at the hadith, there's a couple of things that rise up. Yes, we have the rejection of idolatry, but we also get from the hadith this idea that if human beings create statues or paintings or other representations of living beings, that is blasphemous because they are trying to put themselves on the level of God as a creator. And we're told in the hadith that when the judgment comes, those artists who created, statues or paintings of human beings or animals or other living things will be asked to bring those things to life. And of course, they won't be able to because they're not God. And one hadith, and I'll show you this hadith in a minute, even says how their artistic creations will then be brought to life and they'll attack the artist. Right? So there's some very strong condemnations of art in the hadith, absent from the Quran, but present in the hadith. And that applies not just to religious subjects, but to depicting anything. Just, you want to paint a picture of your dad or something like that, like a portrait that you put on the wall. According to hadith, you're not supposed to do that. Or paint a picture of your cat. According to hadith, you're not supposed to do that. So what we'll see is artists try to reconcile their traditions, the traditional art forms, with those prohibitions. So what we'll see is deliberate abstraction, that if you represent a human being in an abstract form that's very obviously not a living thing, it's kind of an allusion to a human being rather than being an attempt to accurately portray, that it sort of gets a pass. Or you might even abstract something to the point in which you're using something like calligraphy, but the organization of the calligraphy resembles the form of something like an animal or a human being. So we'll see how Muslim artists have danced around prohibitions and things like that as well in a variety of ways. One of the areas of Islamic art that is taken most seriously is depicting God. So it is, you're not going to find Muslim artists even trying to dance around this prohibition. This one is taken very, very seriously, that you do not depict Allah. You do not depict God. Certainly not in a statue, right? In an idol like the Quraysh would have worshipped in pre-Islamic Arabia, but also in terms of a two-dimensional painting, anything like that. So instead, a common substitute, which we'll see in a moment, is to represent God by writing his name or one of his 99 names, right? We learned about that tradition that God has 99 names, according to a hadith. So if Allah has made himself known to humanity through his speech, through the Quran, through his word, then the way in which we can visually represent Allah is through his word. So, for example, simply by writing Allah in Arabic calligraphy, that would be a common way to represent God in Islamic art. And we'll see examples of that. The same is true of Muhammad, that you shouldn't depict Muhammad. So a really orthodox way would be to simply write the name Muhammad. But as Islam expands to other parts of the world, we'll see certain cultures a bit more willing to represent Muhammad in a variety of ways. And one of the ways in which you'll see him represented, especially among the Turks and the Persians, as well as the Indians, is to depict him but leave his face blank. And if we leave his face blank, then we're acknowledging that prophets shouldn't be depicted, but we can still represent him in some ways. And you wouldn't put a depiction like this in the context of a mosque. You would see a depiction of Muhammad like this, illustrating a manuscript. So, for example, perhaps you have a book that talks about Muhammad's night journey and ascension. And so you might have illustrations marking the different events that go on in that story. And so you might see an image like this with Muhammad's face left blank. In some cases, you will see Muslim artists depicting Muhammad's face, not in the context of a mosque in a house of worship, but illustrating manuscripts. There's not a lot of those examples, but you will find some. That sensitivity with regards to depicting Muhammad is also typically extended to all the other prophets. So that when it comes to someone like Jesus or Abraham, you would also avoid the face or excessive depictions as well. Why? Well, one, it's out of respect in that we don't actually know what they look like. So instead of standardizing an imaginary face or an imaginary depiction of this person, we just leave it. But another thing is this sensitivity towards the worship of images, the worship of idols. That if you depict Muhammad, then that depiction could take on a kind of sacred status, and perhaps people to varying degrees might be engaged in idolatry around that image. And certainly, as we see Christianity develop in the Roman Empire, in this Hellenic environment, you'll see the emergence of religious iconography, which is treated in a very sacred way. And from the Muslim perspective, that too is unacceptable, right? It's not just about the pagans. It's even people of the book, that if they are venerating a painting of Jesus, that is still unacceptable from the Muslim point of view. And so you don't want to follow that precedent and begin to venerate images of Muhammad. So we will find some images of Muhammad, typically with his face left blank, but not in the context of religious iconography. Instead, illustration of manuscripts would be a common one. Among the different sectarian branches of Islam, you will find some differences as well. Sunni Islam is much more conservative when it comes to the arts. Shia Islam is more willing to depict holy persons. Right? We know that in Shia Islam, you have this built-in devotion to the family of the Prophet, the holy imams like Imam Hussein. Well, Shia artists have been more willing to depict figures like Imam Hussein, sometimes with their faces left blank, but other times with total realistic figural arts. And we can see that extending not just from two-dimensional art, but even into the three-dimensional realm. If you look at Ashura commemorations, right? So the anniversary of Imam Hussein's death, it's not uncommon to find Shia Muslims with, banners and things like that that may have a statue of Imam Hussein's severed head. Right? Because we know that Imam Hussein's head is severed and brought to Yazid, the wicked caliph. And so you'll see that among Shia communities. In Sufi Islam too, we know that there's a built-in veneration of holy persons. And so there is an openness towards depictions of people in the arts that is much more liberal than sort of non-Sufi Sunni Islam. So with all that established, let's start to look at some examples. Here is a hadith that lays out some of the prohibitions about the visual arts. So this one is found in the collection Sahih Muslim, which Sunnis generally regard as the second most authoritative collection after Sahih Bukhari. And there's stuff in Sahih Bukhari as well. I just happened to select this one out of Sahih Muslim. And it says, I heard the Prophet say, all the painters who make images would be in the fire of hell. The soul will be breathed into every image prepared by him, and it shall punish him in hell. And Ibn Abbas, this is the one who narrates it, said, if you have to do it at all, then paint the images of trees and lifeless things. So there we have a clue about what we're going to see today. That Muslim artists generally preferred in their visual arts to portray not just trees, but vegetation, flowers, and other lifeless things. So things such as geometric designs, patterns, instead of actual peoples. When we think of Greco-Roman, Hellenic, Western arts, there's an emphasis on depictions of the human form. Right? Think of, the great statue of David, for example, right? And perfectly sculpted physique and so on. There's a real emphasis on depiction of the human body in European art, not so in the Islamic tradition. Instead, all the emphasis is on, floral designs and geometric patterns with mathematic precision, what we might describe as decorative arts, decorating the surface of various things. That could be the walls of a mosque, that could be the borders of a manuscript, that could be armor worn into battle. That those are the types of art forms that that lead the way in the Islamic tradition. Now, Islam isn't the first to have these attitudes. So Islam is actually continuing a religious precedent from Judaism. So Judaism, although certain branches of Judaism would be influenced by non-Jewish cultures and their artistic traditions, Judaism also has this traditional prohibition against the creation, the depiction of living things. And we can find this in the Torah. So if we look in our copies of the Bible, you look in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 4 and 5, the Bible says, so this is one of the mitzvahs in the Torah and what the Christians call the Old Testament. And God says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Right? None of it. It doesn't just say don't depict gods. It says don't depict anything that's in heaven, earth, or the sea. Stay away from it. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. So we see this prohibition against realistic figural representations in the arts, and also its connection to the condemnation of idolatry as well. So in Jewish thought, we find this first, and it carries over into the Islamic tradition. Now, Christianity, of course, precedes Islam. We have Judaism first, and then out of first century Judaism, we get this messianic movement that develops in the Roman Empire into Christianity, and then later on, we get Islam. Now, because Christianity developed in the Roman Empire, and people like the Apostle Paul took this religion out of Judaism and began to spread it among non-Jews, the Greeks and so forth. That's why he's called the Apostle to the Gentiles. Greco-Roman culture would have an enormous impact on Christian attitudes towards the visual arts. And they developed theological justifications as well. There are various Christian movements throughout Christian history that have condemned icons and other statues and idolatry. But by and large, Christianity has had an open attitude towards the visual arts, the depiction of not only human beings and living beings, but also of the divine, depicting the Holy Trinity, for example, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And one of the justifications for the sudden openness towards visual arts was that prior to the incarnation, right, Christians believed that Jesus of Nazareth is the human incarnation of God the Son, one of the three co-eternal, co-equal persons of the Holy Trinity. Prior to the incarnation, there had been no physical manifestation of God on earth. But once the incarnation takes place, then there's a sudden permission, as it were, to depict the God, the divine. I see a question has come in. Does this refer to tattoos or dead family members? So there's a separate passage in the Torah that explicitly condemns tattoos. There is a verse about tattoos. Dead family members. Yeah, so Steve is correct there. So there is a verse in the Torah that condemns tattoos. And with regard, Kiara was asking about dead family members. With regard to whether or not it's only things that are living, it's not about the status of someone as either being alive or dead. It's about something that would be alive, right? So you could just depict, let's say you were doing painting a horse. It doesn't actually have to be a real horse that's alive, just the fact that a horse is a living creature. But it's interesting that you raised that point, because one of the things that well, I don't actually have a visual example of this, but one of the things that occurs in Muslim societies is we have these surviving manuscripts where artists depicted like human beings, and then someone came along later and like painted or drew a line like through the throat in order to make the subject dead. So by depicting something that was dead, for some, they considered that made it permissible, that if it was dead, right? So they took that idea of a living thing really literally. So if the subject is dead, then it's okay to depict it. It's just not okay if it's alive. But that's just some of the views. So here we see a famous example of a Christian depiction of God. So this is in the Vatican, the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church. And you see here the person of God the Father. So God the Father, one of the three persons of the Trinity, shown as this old man. He's surrounded by angels. And of course, what we don't see here is that, you have Adam, right? Adam's reaching out his finger to touch God as well. This extends beyond God the Father. Here we have the three persons of the Christian Trinity grouped together. So we see here, for example, God the Father, God the Son, which is Jesus, and then the dove representing the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, because in the Gospels it says that the Holy Spirit descended upon Jesus at his baptism like a dove, right? So the dove comes to be the common way in which God is depicted. So we can see a variety of depictions here. This extends from second dimensional paintings, or two-dimensional paintings and so forth, to sculptures like this. So we have actual physical representations here. We can also see this extend to images of Jesus himself, right? So we have a variety of statues of Jesus that you find in churches, and also of his mother as well, the Virgin Mary, the Queen of Heaven. And it's said, of course, in Christian theology that because she was born without sin, thus making her the proper vessel for God the Son to incarnate in the world, that at the end of her life, she ascends in the body into heaven. So there is no body of Mary on earth. She ascends into heaven, and that she's quite literally the Queen of Heaven, and that she exists in the body there. And so we find statues of her as well. Now, when we talked about the gunpowder empires, one of the empires that we learned about was the Mughal Empire. And the Mughal Empire, of course, was the one that was established in South Asia, right, with its capital in Delhi initially, right? Akbar moves it to Fatehpur Sikri temporarily. And there, of course, you have a Muslim dynasty ruling over a majority Hindu population. And so then you have this really interesting dynamic of an iconoclastic, monotheistic, religious ruling elite governing over a majority polytheistic, pro-image religion in Hinduism, right? It's commonplace in Hinduism for the variety of gods and goddesses to be depicted through the visual arts, often through statues, which are installed in mandirs or Hindu temples and are venerated not just as symbolic representations, but actually earthly conduits by which the presence of the god is actually within the statue, and that one can interact with the god through the statue, right? Darshan takes place, that the god sees you through the murti, through the statue, and you are encountering the god. So Islam existed in these different environments in which gods, in which the divine was portrayed. And in certain contexts, that had a greater influence on Muslim artists. But if we're going really strict by the text, like certain movements will do, including the Wahhabis, which we'll learn about next week, you're not supposed to depict living things like this, right? If we're going really strict by hadiths and so forth, then you want to stay away from the visual arts. So instead of depicting, of course, the gods, but also human beings, animals, other living things, what we see in the tradition of Islamic art is the prominence of calligraphy, of pottery and ceramics, so like handiworks, craftworks, so there's real attention paid to what would otherwise perhaps be seen as mundane, right? So you see a lot of artistic expression in, the crafting of bowls and other vases and things like that. Whereas in Europe, you may have not seen the same amount of attention there. Instead, we're talking about canvases and sculptures and things like that. But not so here. Manuscript illumination, textiles, by which I mean fabrics, that would include things like prayer rugs and so forth, metalworking, and then architecture and gardens. And so when we get to the subject of architecture, I'm also going to look at the different core components of a mosque. Right, so we'll learn about the different elements of mosques in today's lecture. So as I said before, for Muslims, Allah made himself known through his word, through his speech, which is the Quran. So if you're going to represent God, then you should do so through his word, which is the way in which he communicated his existence to humanity. So what we see is the emergence of calligraphy, specifically Arabic calligraphy, because the Quran is in Arabic, emerging as really the preeminent branch of Islamic art. It's the most sacred art, the most important art. And we see Arabic calligraphy applied to a variety of contexts. We see it decorating the interior of mosques. we see manuscripts of the Quran written in this beautiful decorative calligraphy, right? Not just, you know, get the letters down there, right? We see this really beautiful, even, you know, gold leaf applied to it, really decorative applications to handwritten copies of the Quran. We'll see it applied to things like armor. So I'll show you some examples of like battle helmets worn by the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals. And we'll see calligraphy, beautiful calligraphy decorating helmets and things like that, swords, weapons. It's applied to all these different contexts. And so if we're thinking about what are some of the unifying features of quote unquote Islamic art, right? That category with all its faults that we're going to see, you know, ranging from Indonesia to Bosnia to northern Nigeria. Arabic calligraphy is one of those reoccurring features that we're going to see again and again. So here's some common ways in which Allah is depicted by Muslim artists by writing his name. And of course, Allah has 99 names, as I said, but Allah is the most prominent one. And you can see the creativity of the way this word is written, right? So we have some basic letters. We have alif, lem, he. And here, for example, we have the letter aleph, the A at the beginning of the word. Instead of being here, which would be the ordinary place for it, the artist had placed the aleph sort of lying over the rest of the letters. It's actually sitting between the second L and the he. And the different vowels and grammatical markings also take on a kind of decorative flourish. So we see the shadda, which looks like a little W. That's there to tell us that we're supposed to like hold the L. So you say Allah. So that becomes decorative. And we have vowels too that become decorative. You can see that going on here. Adds to the balance of the composition. Here we have the two L's intertwining and wrapping with each other, right? That's not ordinarily how you would write the letter L or lem in Arabic. And I will tell you that as a non-native speaker of Arabic, and this is probably true of native speakers as well, there are times where the calligraphy gets so elaborate, so decorative, that I can't make out the words, right? It's so, the letters are placed in different positions, right? Because the composition is really dominating what you're seeing rather than grammatical organization. And I can struggle in trying to actually decipher what's there. Here we have some representations of Muhammad. So instead of doing a depiction of Muhammad as a human being, right? Instead, we just have the name Muhammad written in Arabic. And here too, we can see some creativity, the way the letters are laid out. So this is the letter meme and ha, meme and del. The del is unusually large here for the sake of balance. And the meme, right, if you're just writing it really ordinarily, you probably put it here. But instead, it's sort of this decorative flourish sitting above the letter ha. And you can see the use of the short vowels, the waw, for example, like balancing the composition. And then you have also the addition here of the sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, peace and blessings be upon him, which is traditionally said after saying the name Muhammad, or other prophets you say alayhi salam as well, upon him be peace. Here you can see a really common decorative style. Here the meme is sitting on top and then it zigzags down to the ha, and this is the second M. So here's the M here, this is the M in this one, and then you have this really large D, the del there. And so this becomes a way in which you represent Muhammad, for example, in a mosque. I'll show you some images of Ottoman mosques, and they tend to have these sort of large, we could call them like talismans almost, right? These medallions, that's probably a better word. These large sort of medallions decorating the walls, and one will say Allah in calligraphy, one will say Muhammad. They might have the names of the 4 rightly guided caliphs as well, right? Because Ottoman Empire is a Sunni empire. So that's how you would represent these people. Now, there are some differences between Sunnis and Shia. So in Shia Islam, while there are some who share the Sunni hesitation, anxiety, if not hostility towards the visual arts, there are other Shia who are much more open to it. And so here we see a depiction of the 12 holy imams with Ali in the middle. And the only one who's missing a face here is the 12th imam, and that's because, of course, we don't know what he looks like. He disappeared when he was a boy in the 9th century, and he'll return as a man, as the Mahdi, the guided one. So we don't know what he looks like. But we have Ali here. and Hassan and Hussein. So that's quite typical in Shia Islam. And here we can see two paintings of Imam Hussein. So if you were to visit a country like Iran, it would not be unusual at all for people to have posters or framed portraits of Imam Hussein. Whereas if you went to a Sunni country, yeah, they're not prophets, but still, you know, you wouldn't even see in a Sunni country, you wouldn't even see like a framed portrait of Abu Bakr or Umar or Uthman, right? You're not going to see that, or Ali. You're not going to see that either. But in the Shia tradition, there's much more openness towards this type of portrait work. You know, I haven't explored Shia hadith enough. I should do that. Look in the Shia hadith and see if there are hadiths in Shia Islam that repeat the sentiment that I showed you from the Sunni hadiths. Because I'd be interested to know how they reconcile those with this type of art. Here we can see the use of a really beautiful decorative calligraphy in the pages of a Quran manuscript. So this is from the Quran, and you can see how the text here is really large. So the goal of the scribe here wasn't to maximize getting as much of the Quran as possible on the page, right? Instead, the attention here is really much more on the beauty of the calligraphy, and we have some in gold leaf. We also have this beautiful decorative surah heading. So this tells us that this is the start of a new surah. In fact, this is the basmallah here, the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And you can see the way the surah heading is decorated with well, I guess you could call it kind of a geometric floral pattern. It's abstracted and extends all the way into the border here. And we also have these other decorative symbols marking the text, right? So we can really see the attention paid to calligraphy as an art form rather than trying to maximize how many verses of the Quran can we get on this single page. Here you can see similar decorative functions, albeit here the scribe has put a lot more of the Quran onto the page, but we have another decorative surah heading, the use of what looks like it was probably gold leaf. It sort of lost its flair. These decorative floral symbols used to mark the end of an ayah, of a verse of the Quran, and you can see an alteration in size that along the bottom and the top of the page, the letters of the text become large, right? So we have an artistic choice going on there. And we have, again, some more of these decorative, very flat, geometric and floral flourishes to the page. This one is from North Africa, and you'll notice that apart from the decorative elements, that the way the Arabic is written is different. So there are different types of Arabic script. It's still Arabic, but you can write it in different ways. And I guess one analogy would be like, you know, in English, you can either print the letters or you can use cursive, right? Still English, it's still the same letters, but you're writing it differently. So there are different types of Arabic script. And this style of script here is very typical of the Maghreb, of North Africa. It's sort of, in the age of the modern printing press, it's kind of diminished, but prior to the modern printing press, where you see greater uniformity in the types of scripts that are used, in the time of scribes writing by hand, this was commonplace. Here you can see some artists playing with the prohibition against depicting living things by abstractly representing a human being and a leopard using calligraphy. Right? So it's like, oh, it's not really a human being seated in prayer. It's calligraphy. This is Arabic words, but the words have been arranged to resemble a human being who's actually in the concluding steps of the daily prayer. And here we see a leopard also created with Arabic words, decorative use of calligraphy, sort of pushing the boundaries, right? Still following the rules, but pushing the boundaries at the same time. Here we can see some examples of different types of scripts. And depending on what part of the world you're in, again, prior to the modern printing press, you would see certain types of scripts predominate. This isn't all the scripts. There are others as well. For example, we don't see We don't see the Kufic script. When we looked at the early Quran manuscripts way back in the first section of the course, I compared manuscripts. Some were written in the Hijazi script and others in the Kufic script. Kufic was written very much like block letters. It almost looks like someone had a stamp and kind of printed those letters. We don't see that here. The Nashk script is really common. If you get mass-produced copies of the Quran, like the 1924 official edition of the Quran that was produced in Cairo, it's in that script. And then this script you find in the Eastern Islamic world. So it gets adopted to be used in other languages like Farsi and Urdu and South Asia and other places as well. Here we see the application of Arabic calligraphy to decorate the kiswa. The kiswa is the black shroud that covers the holy Kaaba in Mecca. Okay, so the Kaaba is the most important shrine in Islam, and the building itself is made of brick. And so today, in modern times, a new cover is made every year. There's always been a cover for it. The frequency by which it was changed in earlier periods, I'm not aware of, but these days it's changed every year. And because of the great wealth of Saudi Arabia, and we'll learn more about Saudi Arabia in a lecture next week when I talk about Wahhabism, the kiswa is actually decorated in calligraphy that is sewn into the fabric with gold thread. So this is actual gold. So enormous wealth is spent on the creation of the kiswa, which if you read the Quran and the Hadith, I'm not sure that that's a good use of funds, right? There's a real attention on giving to the poor, and there's certainly plenty of poor people in the world. I'm not sure that that's the best use of gold to decorate the kiswa, but that's just me. Here we can see the section of the kiswa that would go around the door of the Kaaba. You can see the beautiful decorative calligraphy, and you can see the way the words are arranged to really fill out and balance the space. This can make it difficult to read because you're used to just reading, right to left, very clear sequence of letters and words. But here, the words are arranged above each other and letters are interlocking with each other. Surrounding the calligraphy, then we have different floral designs, sort of resembling leaves and branches or flowers that fill in all the other spaces around the calligraphy. Beautiful stuff. Here we can see the use of calligraphy to decorate the interior of mosques. So we have an example of calligraphy being painted here, and then also carved into the actual building materials itself. So here we have the decorative calligraphy carved into the stone. Here too, I don't know whether this is stone or plaster, but you can see calligraphy intertwined with abstract floral patterns. So we see what looks like flowers, petals, leaves of branches accompanying the design of the calligraphy on the interior of this mosque. Here we see the use of calligraphy on painted tile work. So this is the realm of ceramics. It becomes a major industry in the medieval Islamic world. You can see the different tiles painted in various types of floral designs along with the Arabic calligraphy. This is a Shia site. And you'll also notice that the grading on these window sections is organized in a geometric pattern. That when you read the Quran, there's all these verses about Allah's creation and his order and the beauty of his creation and the fact that there is a deliberate plan to his designs of the universe. So when we look at the geometric patterns in Islamic art like these, it evokes that sense of order, right? That everything is precise and structured. It's not chaos, right? Everything is balanced and ordered because ultimately the universe itself is following a divine order established by Allah, and that everything will be fulfilled as planned, part of his qadar, his decree for his creation. Here we can see the use of calligraphy on the exterior of a dome of a mosque. And I want to draw your attention to, right, we have the calligraphy here and all the shaddas and the voweling and so forth, but there's a geometric feature to this calligraphy that I want to point out because it might surprise people in modern times. And it's right there. So we see a six-pointed star, right? Two interlocking triangles. That is a common geometric design that you find historically in different types of Islamic art. Now, the reason why it's surprising to some people today is because that symbol comes to be known in Jewish communities as the Star of David, and it shows up on the flag of the State of Israel, which was established in 1948. And so because of the hostilities that exist, principally between the Arab states and Israel, but more broadly between the Muslim world and the State of Israel, it surprises people that you find a six-pointed star in works of Islamic art, but in fact, it's quite common. And we shouldn't assume also that the association is with the figure of David, that it's also just a basic geometric symbol, right? Two interlocking triangles, six-pointed star. It's a pretty mundane symbol, as it were, but don't be surprised if you see that symbol showing up on mosques and other works of Islamic art. Here we can see the application of Arabic calligraphy on the interior of a Muslim palace, what we might describe as a secular setting, right? A facility that doesn't have any kind of explicit religious purpose. This is a residence, a dwelling for a ruler, and you can see the way the calligraphy adorns every aspect of the surface. I mean, look at how every bit of the surface here is either decorated with calligraphy, geometric patterns like the interior of the vault here, or different floral patterns. And then even in these surfaces, which are relatively unadorned, the shape itself plays on light. So we're playing off light and shadow to create another visual point of interest in the surface. So what you see is this tendency really to decorate all these different surface levels, right? Whether it's a wall of a palace, the wall of a mosque, the surface of a serving dish, the surface of battle armor, of a weapon, that all of those are opportunities for artists to apply calligraphy, geometric patterns, floral patterns, abstracted living beings even as well. So calligraphy is really preeminent, but after Arabic calligraphy, the geometric patterns and the floral patterns are really gonna be the most common reoccurring design choices that we'll see in Islamic art and architecture. As I mentioned before, the precision of the geometric patterns is meant to recall the idea that there's a divine order to the world, that Allah has created the world and put everything in the way it's supposed to, just as the sun and the moon, you know, from the human perspective on earth follows a particular course, that there's an order, an underlying order to everything. That even though it may seem, you know, in certain moments in our lives that there's chaos and, you know, uncertainty, ultimately there's this divine order that Allah is in control of all things. And so that's what's meant to be recalled by this type of beautiful, precise, mathematical design that we see here. Here's some more examples of those geometric patterns, and you can see the way this blends into floral patterns as well. This beautiful gray here, which is done just with such precision, that's actually stone. That's carved out of stone, if you can believe that. A question came in. How is the cloth mounted? How is it stabilized during rain? Oh, the kiswa? So the kiswa has fasteners on top. So you climb up to the roof of the Kaaba and it's fastened up there and it stays there. And there's actually, there's like a spigot on the side of the Kaaba that when it rains, the water flows out of the spigot. And there's even some traditions about standing beneath the spigot and getting the water, the rainwater that falls on your head. But the kiswa cloth is pretty much okay. It doesn't rain a whole lot in Mecca, but there are seasonal rains. And in fact, you can even find some pictures of flooding in Mecca. You'll see the Kaaba with like 2 feet of water surrounding it because certain monsoons, certain seasonal rains really drench the area, and the dry land can't absorb it quick enough. So it creates flash floods. I'm sure modern Mecca has a drainage system, but in earlier times, flash floods could be a problem in the Hijaz. Here we can see the application of those same principles on serving dishes. And beautiful serving dishes also came to be a popular trading good on the Silk Road with China. So you had Chinese porcelain, you had this Chinese tradition of ceramics as well, and you have this interaction with the Islamic world, extending all the way into North Africa. So you can see this two-dimensional floral pattern, and I have some examples of calligraphy being applied here as well. This particular dish has this flat, reoccurring floral pattern with this beautiful balance to it, and then you can see here's the Arabic calligraphy lining the edge of the serving dish. Here we can see the application of different patterns in calligraphy to glasswork, and the images I have here are of lamps that would be used to illuminate the interior of mosques and madrasas and other buildings. And obviously in modern times we have electricity, and so there's not as much need for these. But traditionally, these lamps would be decorated with the verse of light from the Quran, which is in Surah 24, Surah An-Nur, which talks about God being the light of the heavens and the earth. And so that ayah of the Quran was often used to decorate these glass lamps. And even in mosques today that have electricity, you'll still see these hanging. They may have bulbs in them, or they might just be hanging for decorative reasons. I think another question came in. Steve asks, is that pottery decoration common to all classes or more common only among social elites? Yeah, I mean, so that stuff was, that was high-end stuff, right? So if you're a peasant working on a farm in Egypt, you're not going to have access to that sort of stuff. You would probably have a simple clay bowl or maybe a wood bowl or something like that. Certainly the people with the money would be the ones who would typically have that. But what you see is throughout different Muslim societies is the application of those design elements again and again on those otherwise mundane day-to-day household items. Here we can see those principles applied to some textiles. So in the medieval period, the caliphate, the Islamic empires were like the preeminent producer of textiles in the world at that time. And the fabrics that came out of the Muslim world were highly sought after in Christian Europe as well. And there's even some instances where Christian artists creating religious iconography depicted the Virgin Mary, and since the Virgin Mary is the most important woman of all time, she's shown in the finest fabrics of the time, and those fabrics happen to be Islamic fabrics. And how do we know that? Because the European artists, in a few instances, must have put some textiles they acquired from the Muslim world that happen to have Arabic calligraphy on them, and then they just completely reproduced what the textile looked like. So there's a few images of the Virgin Mary produced by Christians where she's wearing a garment that actually has Islamic calligraphy on her garments. Here you can see the principles apply to prayer rugs. So prayer rugs are commonly used by Muslims because during the 5 daily prayers, when one prostrates and puts your face to the ground, you know, just for practical reasons, it's good not to just put your face in the dirt. So you want a clean surface to put it on. There might be another point of origin for these rugs, and that is in Judaism. To give you a pre-Islamic example again, in Judaism, there was a time in which Jews would pray on an open surface, particularly on stone, but it's said that the pagans, that these polytheists used to pray on stone, so Jews stopped doing that and began to always pray with some kind of cloth or something beneath them, not directly on the ground, not directly on the stone. So that could have been an influence in the development of the use of carpets in Islamic practice as well. That's conjecture on my part, but it's an interesting line of inquiry. So here we can see various geometric patterns and floral patterns, all abstracted. The only deviation from a clear balance to these designs is the fact that we have a certain design telling us where the head is supposed to go during prostration. So on both of these carpets, this one is from the Ottoman Empire and this one is from the Safavid Empire. This is where you would put your head. So that's the part of the carpet that would face the Qibla, the direction of the Kaaba in Mecca, and this is the direction here too as well. This is a Quran stand. So we talked before in our discussion of the Quran about how you wouldn't let the Quran touch the ground. You want to keep it elevated, right? Because it's sacred. So just like Americans, the custom is not to let the flag touch the ground. In Islam, you wouldn't let the Quran touch the ground. You want to keep it elevated, and that's certainly true in Judaism as well. You wouldn't let the Torah touch the ground. And so you would place the Quran in a reading stand to keep it elevated. And we can see how the wood has been decorated with calligraphy along the borders here, as well as in this area. And then we have this decorative floral pattern as well. Notice again, the absence of human beings, the absence of animals, at least in any real explicit sense. There may be some abstract allusions to animals like birds or something. I don't happen to see any in this instance, but there's a real emphasis on abstraction. Here we can see the application of these principles to metalworking. So we see the entire surface of these dishes decorated. We have a very abstract kind of floral pattern recurring throughout the surface of this vessel. Here too, we have it paired with calligraphy in some type of gold leaf going around the edges of both the top and the base of that object, which is probably an incense burner. Here we have some candlesticks from different periods in Egypt, medieval and early modern Egypt. You can see the use of Arabic calligraphy on the metal paired with these geometric designs. Here too, the calligraphy with these floral and geometric designs all around the surface of the candlestick. And here we can see the application of those principles to a weapon. So this is a battle axe, although I don't know whether it was ever used in battle. It's so beautiful, maybe it was just ceremonial. And this one, the blacksmith, the artisan, the creator, and probably the owner of this axe was, I would guess, a Shia Muslim, because the axe head says the name Ali twice. So it says Ain Lem Yeah, right? Yeah. So it says the name Ali here, and it says it here. And one of the interesting artistic elements that they did here, Ali had a sword with 2 points, 2 tips to it. The blade split like a snake tongue almost, right? It split. So at the end of the letter Ya here, it splits into the 2 points like Ali's sword. So it's quite a clever way of writing the name Ali on this axe. These are battle helmets from the 3 gunpowder empires, which we learned about last time. So on the left, we have a helmet from 18th century Mughal Empire in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. In the center, we have a battle helmet from Safavid Persia, this time from the 16th century. And on the right, we have a battle helmet from the mighty Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. So here too, we see Arabic calligraphy, and we see different floral and geometric patterns. It's harder to see in the Mughal one, but it's covering the entire surface of the top of the helmet. Beautiful helmets. And I would suppose that, these helmets were probably worn by commanders rather than sort of the frontline infantry, that would have been charging into battle, the ones that would have been most likely to die. These types of beautiful helmets would have been worn by commanders and noblemen who could afford to produce such elaborate armor. So when I do this lecture typically, and I have students in the classroom, I ask them to look at these, and based on what we know about Islamic art so far, which one of the 3 is Islamic art? And I'm realizing now that I only have 16 minutes left to cover mosque architecture, so I want to just run through this. The answer for those looking is A. So we see the geometric patterns and the real balance throughout the composition. Here, we have birds, so we have living things, and then also it's not flat, right? We have a clear foreground through the layering of the designs, and then this one, while it does, it is very flat and geometric, it also doesn't have the same balance. So the answer here is A, in case you were playing along. So let's move on to mosque architecture. Well, I have some more material before I get to the mosques. All right, let's try and move through this briefly here. So here's some instances where we do see living beings depicted, but look at the way they're abstracted. So this is from medieval medical manuscripts, right? And you could understand why, if it's a medical manuscript, you could understand why there's a need to depict the human body. They're charting the organs of the body, the nerves of the body, in order to instruct people, right? It's the basis of knowledge. But here too, the artist has abstracted the human form. So if you look at the head here, the head is a perfect circle. And obviously, the human head is not a perfect circle, right? This isn't because the artist is bad. This is a deliberate abstraction. Right? So there's elements of realism to serve the purpose, but here too, abstraction is going on. A perfect circle to represent the human head. Here, in this diagram of a skeleton, the ribs are just perfect straight lines. And obviously, that's not the case. And it's not because the artist is incapable of drawing a curved rib, but abstraction is going on here. Attention is being paid to those traditional prohibitions against depicting things in a realistic fashion. Here's an example of a kind of secular context. These are Persian manuscript illustrations. So this is from a work of Persian literature in the 12th century. It's a love story, and the manuscript has been illustrated. And you can see that the figures are much more realistic, but there's still these familiar Islamic elements, that the whole of the surface is decorated, that you don't have a real clear foreground and a background. Notice that the figures here that are supposed to be in the background are of the same size as the figure in the foreground. So instead of using three-dimensional perspective, everything is flat, as if it's on the same plane. And the way in which you suggest depth is through layering. So you see that this figure is partly cut off by this, which appears to be, I don't know, a bush or part of a hill or something like that. These figures are behind these rocks. So it's through layering that depth is suggested rather than through three-dimensional perspective. And so Islamic artists, or artists from the Islamic world, that's probably a better way to phrase it, would avoid three-dimensional depth and perspective because of the way it alludes to reality. Instead, you have this emphasis on a flat work of art. Right here, the figures in the background are the same size as the figures in the foreground, but we know that they're in the back because of this layering, right? Half their bodies are cut off by this hill, and this hill is obviously behind these figures because they're not cut off by it. So that's how we're indicating depth, maintaining two-dimensional, very flat composition without lapsing into three-dimensional depth. Here we can see depictions of Mecca, the Kaaba, and there's so much attention on two-dimensional depth here that it looks like the Kaaba is laying on its side. Right? Instead of looking down from it, the Kaaba is put to look on its side. That's not because the artist is bad and incapable of doing three-dimensional perspective. There is deliberate thought going into this type of composition. Here we can see two illustrations of the story of Muhammad's ascent into heaven. And over the centuries, that story gets more and more embellished in more and more details. And we have Muhammad having conversations with different prophets and seeing the different levels of heaven and hell and so on. And some artists would illustrate that story. And here Muhammad is shown without a face in both pictures. The one on the left, you can see, is still very flat. So you have all these angels surrounding Muhammad, and he's sitting atop El-Buraq. In the Hadith, El-Buraq is like a white, he's a cross between like a mule and a pony. It's like a white horse. But subsequent artists would increasingly make Buraq look more and more like a lamassu. A lamassu is a mythical animal of ancient Persia, which was like a winged horse with a human head. And so that's what El-Buraq ends up looking like in these subsequent depictions here. But look at this one. We have that attention to two-dimensional art here, but here suddenly we have three-dimensional depth. This is pretty rare. Suddenly we can tell the foreground and the background, that the wall here is noticeably smaller than the wall in the foreground, suggesting three-dimensional depth and perspective. So we have someone toying with those elements in their composition, but that's not the norm. That's not what we would usually see. So again, I would typically ask students if they were here, which one of these is the Islamic art? And the answer here is C. Look at the way everything is very flat. We have Adam here. This is Adam after his creation. And then in the Quran, Allah says to the angels to bow down before Adam. So the angels are bowing down. And look at how the angels, whether they're in the background or the foreground, are the same size. And it kind of looks like the angels in the background are floating because they're not properly drawn in perspective, in a smaller size than the angels in the foreground. All right, now, mosque architecture. So mosques, as we know, are the houses of prayer. The word masjid in Arabic means the place of prostration, the place of sujood, of sajada, where you bow down before God. That these are the buildings where people would gather on Friday for the congregational prayer, buildings oriented to face the Kaaba in Mecca. And in their basic architectural design, they resemble early synagogues, that was the precursor to mosque design. But of course, over Islamic history, mosques are going to develop distinctive elements that are unique to them. So we're going to see the application of these traditional forms of Islamic art to mosque architecture. We're going to see calligraphy. We're going to see the geometric and the floral patterns. We'll see architects playing with light and shadow. So that might include, shapes like domes, which play off light and shadow, but also the use of pools, reflecting pools, in order to keep create a visual experience as well. So if you saw, for example, this isn't a mosque. The Taj Mahal isn't a mosque. It's actually a tomb. But the Taj Mahal has a big reflecting pool in front of it. So if you're standing in front of the reflecting pool, it looks like you can see two mirror images of the Taj Mahal and its central dome. One, the actual Taj, but then the rest in the reflecting pool in front of you. So you'll see that in mosques as well. So here is one of the earliest examples of Islamic art. Some people would say this is the first true Islamic monument ever built because, of course, the Kaaba already existed before Islam. This is the Dome of the Rock, constructed by the Umayyad caliphs at the end of the 7th century. We have this beautiful central golden dome, and then we have this decorative tile work, which includes geometric patterns and floral designs, but also calligraphy, right? We can see this beautiful Arabic calligraphy lining the exterior of the Dome of the Rock. And the Dome of the Rock is more of a shrine than a mosque, but there is a prayer center within the shrine itself, so we could call it a mosque as well. And of course, the building itself is shaped. It has it has 8 sides. So it itself is shaped as a geometric shape itself. Here are the core elements that you would find within a mosque. So we have the mihrab, which is the niche at the wall that faces the Kaaba in Mecca. So when you enter the masjid, you know which way you're supposed to bow when you do your daily prayers. You look for the mihrab. Then there's also a minbar. The minbar is the pulpit. So where the imam goes and gives his khutbah, his sermon from, he goes up the minbar, and that's where he would stand or sit to deliver the sermon. Mosques would eventually develop what's called a minara or a minaret. This is a tower from which someone would do the call to prayer, the adhan, to notify the community that it's time to come and do the prayer. And then the central space for performing the prayers is the musalla, an open floor space, no chairs or pews or benches, where people line up to stand and do the daily prayer. Synagogues originally had open floors like that as well, but then they began to use chairs and benches and so forth. So they're not open spaces anymore. There will also be some type of facility for the performance of the ritual ablutions, wudu. So that might be a fountain. In modern times, if you go to a modern mosque, there'll be, probably a section of the bathrooms where there's benches and multiple faucets, so you can stand in front of the faucets or sit from the faucets and wash. And mosques, for a while, you don't see this in contemporary mosques anymore, used to have a special platform for the recitation of the Quran, and then a large stand for the copy of the Quran kept in the mosque. In modern times, that's not typically the case because Qurans are mass produced, so you'd have a bookshelf with 100 copies of the Quran. But back when Qurans had to be written by hand, and it was much, a written copy of the Quran was much more rare, that's where you have those types of elements. So this is an image from the Sultan Hassan Mosque Madrasa in Cairo. This is the mihrab, this is the niche that points the direction of Mecca. And this is the minbar. So this is the pulpit, this beautiful decorated wooden door. So the imam would go up here to deliver his khutbah, his sermon, to the faithful who have gathered. And this is part of the musalla, the open floor space. And you can see that the carpet here is arranged in rows. And so this way, when you walk in here, you know you can line up right here on these rows, and it's spaced out sufficiently, ideally, where you're not going to run into the person in front of you. Now, on a crowded Friday, you might run into the people in front of you because it can get really packed. But the carpet is supposed to help establish well-spaced rows for the performance of the prayer. Here we see some different examples of minarets. Now, different civilizations, different empires would use different styles of minarets. So in parts of the world where different empires ruled at different times, you can look at their skyline, and based on the style of the minaret, you can actually go, oh, that structure is from the Ottoman Empire, that's from the Abbasid period, that's from the Fatimids, right? You can tell what period of history it's from based on the minaret. In North Africa, in places like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, it's very common to see minarets that are like a square tower. It looks a little bit like a clock tower. In Turkey and regions that were ruled by the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman-style minarets kind of look like pencils. They're these pointy, tall structures that have multiple balconies on them. And Ottoman mosques tended to have multiple minarets. So some of the Grand Imperial mosques would have 6 minarets. These are from the Ayyubid period, the Ayyubid and Mamluk period in Egypt. And this distinctive style of minaret has been revived in modern times, what's called the Neo-Mamluk style. In fact, the mosque in Washington, D.C., the Islamic Center of Washington, D.C. has a Neo-Mamluk style minaret to it. This unique minaret dates from the Abbasid period. This style was not widely used. Obviously, you can see that the architectural work would be quite significant to create this. These are stairs. And so you wind along this minaret. There are some, this one's in Iraq. There's another one in Cairo in the Ibn Tulun Mosque that's from the Abbasid period, but they're not as widely found, as common as these other styles. Here's some more images of a musalla, of the open prayer space. We have the mihrab in the front wall. This is a minbar too, a much smaller one. So you would line up here in rows for the prayer. And you can see some bookshelves here for copies of the Quran that people might read from as they're waiting for the prayer to begin. This is one of the first large congregational mosques in Islamic history. This one is built by the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, and it has a lot of old Byzantine design elements to it. You can see the decorative gold leaf here, and there's various flowers and plants in the designs throughout this Umayyad mosque, and that's meant to recall the images of paradise that are described in the Quran. The Quran is this lush, verdant garden of trees and shade, and so you have all these images of the gardens of paradise decorating this Umayyad mosque. This shrine, by the way, inside of the mosque is said to be the grave of John the Baptist. So he's the prophet Yahya in the Quran, and revered by, obviously, Christians and Muslims. And Pope John Paul II actually visited this mosque and went to the tomb of John the Baptist there. These are some interior images of what was once the Grand Mosque of Cordoba, when Cordoba was the capital of a Muslim caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain. In the 13th century, Cordoba was conquered by the Catholic forces from the north, and the Grand Mosque was converted into a Roman Catholic cathedral. So the mosque today is a church, it's a Catholic cathedral, but it still maintains a lot of the ancient mosque architecture. So this is the mihrab of the Grand Mosque, or what is now a church. This is the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, and you can see the different Mamluk and Ayyubid minarets here. Here's the main Musalla area of the mosque with the mihrab pointing the direction of Mecca. There's actually multiple mihrabs here because it's such a big mosque. And you can see the open air courtyard. An open air courtyard is very common in different mosques. And according to accounts of the Prophet's mosque in Medina when he was still alive back in the 620s, his mosque essentially consisted of a walled courtyard with one area roofed over. And so the idea of an open air courtyard is something that shows up in mosques a lot as well. The Prophet's mosque didn't have a minaret, by the way, and was a much more simpler structure. So we see mosque architecture get more and more fancy and developed over time. This is a mud brick mosque in Jenne in Mali. And here's an example of a mosque being built with the resources that are local. So there's not enough trees in this part of Mali, so the mosque is built with mud brick. And these are minarets here. Look quite different than Ottoman minarets or Mamluk or North African minarets. An open air courtyard as well. Open air courtyard here with the minarets and the musalla in the central space. This is a Safavid mosque. This was built by Shah Abbas, the greatest of the Safavid Shahs. And you can see here that the minarets have become these decorative elements attached to these vaults, quite diminished from their earlier status as places that people would actually climb up and do the call to prayer from. This is a Mughal one. Here they've used false domes. These domes, which are quite bulbous looking, they don't actually have, if you were to walk inside and look up, you wouldn't see the interiors of the domes. They're fake. You would just see the flat roof. And although there is this covered musalla here, there's a huge open air courtyard. So on Fridays, this open air courtyard would be full of worshipers as well. And here we see one of the great Ottoman mosques. This is the Blue Mosque of Sultan Ahmed. And it has 6 minarets, an open air courtyard, multiple domes, and a variety of, it has clinics and a soup kitchen and a madrasa and all these facilities as part of this grand imperial Ottoman mosque complex. All right, I'm totally out of time now. In fact, I'm 2 minutes over, so sorry for going over. Apparently I need to reduce this lecture a little bit. There's too much to talk about. And we have our exam on Thursday. I'll send everyone an email to remind them. Have a good day.